Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to talk about the growth of climate anxiety and how it's impacting mental health. These days, everyone is aware of climate change. Most of us experience climate-related disasters either directly or through the news on a daily basis. This can lead to emotional anxiety that may express itself as distress about future climate disasters or even distress over the long-term existence of humanity, distress over the survival of our children and their families. Now, it's important to note that worry about climate is not the same as climate anxiety. We all need to be worried about climate issues. This is a healthy response to real problems. But when worry becomes anxiety, it can lead to physiological symptoms like a racing heart, shortness of breath, and it can get in the way of healthy relationships and good performance at work and school. Especially today, as the world experiences a growing political shift towards climate denialism, it is far too easy for those of us worried about climate issues to cross over into climate anxiety. We need to understand the difference, symptoms, and the way to emotionally cope with today's very real climate issues. We're joined today on Zoom by Sammy Aaron, founder and executive director of the Resilient Activist. Hi, Sammy.
Hey Bob, thanks for having me and for hosting this.
Dr. Charles Couchman, clinical psychologist and organizer with the climate activist group Extinction Rebellion Austin. Hi, Charles.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, thank you for hosting.
Moore Keshet, founder and clinician of Integrative Creative Arts Therapy. Hi, Moore.
Hi, it's good to be here with all of you.
Dr. Joseph Talercio, assistant professor of psychology and clinical psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College at New York Presbyterian's Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. Hi, Joe.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
And Rebecca Weston, co-executive director of the Climate Psychology Alliance. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. Rebecca, I'd like to start with you. How does climate change affect mental health?
That's a huge question. How does climate
It
change?
is.
I think I will start by saying that there's an enormous variation in how it affects mental health. But I think all of the variations include some level of feeling of threat about and the precarity of one's future, whether that means one's identity as a farmer, as a grandparent watching one's children's survivability, as a planet, whether our species will continue to thrive and exist. There is a deep sense of precarity and existential threat that sometimes is more in the abstract future and sometimes is very present and near and has already been felt. And there's a whole continuum along those lines. And I am really excited to hear everyone talk about this because I think we're all going to have a very interesting and interwoven take on all of that stuff. So I'm going to turn it back over because I would love to have the conversation continue with them.
Absolutely. More, are emotional responses to the climate crisis real? Are they substantiated?
They're totally substantiated. I mean, for parents, for instance, along with the task of needing to love our children, we're really here to keep them safe, right? To keep them out of harm's way. And so when very real and conclusive harm is befalling children and their ability to thrive and survive, these are really substantiated concerns that, again, to Rebecca's point, are on this spectrum from anxiety to just all out despair. I think that young people are really contending with ideas that, the future that was supposedly, waiting for them is no longer a certainty. And that can create a tremendous amount of cynicism and nihilism and hopelessness.
Joseph, when we talked earlier, you mentioned that climate change can directly impact existing psychiatric problems. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, right. In addition to really for anybody experiencing the distress from the changing temperatures and climate, there is decades of data backing up that direct impacts of the weather can impact our mood, our behaviors. Essentially, and unfortunately, every single psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, really is impacted by rising temperatures. Psychosis gets worse. There's more hospitalizations. Suicidality increases. Self-harm increases. More mood dysregulation. If someone has bipolar disorder, they're more likely to switch from mania to depression. Substance use, particularly alcohol abuse, and even heroin use, they all skyrocket during hotter times. Really, there's nothing that is unfortunately spared as temperatures get worse. And even with people without psychiatric conditions are going to feel those impacts.
You're actually talking about the physical symptoms of global warming, just getting warmer impacting people. This isn't even anxiety driven there. That's just the physical environment you're living in.
Separate things, correct. Just it has a direct impact, and then there's the anxiety of watching the climate and the world change.
Mhm. Simon, you work a lot with climate activists. Do you feel like they're more affected by climate anxiety?
Climate activists live with climate anxiety. Um, if you're an activist and let's say you're working in land use and you drive out of your driveway every single day, partly because you're still driving a car because there's no mass transportation where you live. So you're driving your car out, and in the beautiful neighborhood you live in, all you see are invasive species and mowed lawns. And so there's this constant reminder of what's wrong. In every minute, every place they look, there's something that's not healthy for the environment. And it becomes overwhelming for a lot of people, right? Where they can't look away and see anything that might feel healthy or joyful or welcoming, because they can just be overshadowed by what they see that's wrong. And it's one of the things that we work with, especially with activists in land use. If all they see are invasive species, even when they go out to nature, right? There's all these amazing studies of the emotional benefits of time spent in nature. And when all you can see out in the natural world is devastation, destruction, and invasive species, those environmentalists can't even appreciate or receive that benefit of time in nature. And so it takes a little bit of finessing to help them find tools and ways to be in nature and be able to appreciate it. So, yeah.
You're really describing climate anxiety right there. Charles, I noticed in some of your notes, you talked about emotions that might otherwise be considered healthy, activated emotions and how they turn into climate anxiety. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. And as a therapist, and then also as someone who works with activists and an activist myself, I've come to appreciate that underneath what we call climate anxiety, we can think of that there's these active, very healthy emotions also. And when it comes to the climate emergency, I think two of the big ones are love, especially for anything outside of our immediate circle, the more than human world, other people, and then rage, which is it gets a bad rap, but rage in the sense of our desire to stand up for what's important to us, to protect what's important to us, to assert ourselves, set our limits. And if we've learned, though, to fear these emotions, which happens for most of us in our society, we learn that these aren't okay to feel for whatever reason. Then when we feel them, and the climate emergency, of course, triggers these emotions big time, but we feel them and then we have anxiety on top of those feelings. And we need those feelings because that's our organism gearing up for action and to take care of the problem. But if instead we can end up with all this anxiety and then we engage in defensive things that get in the way, and then that kind of combination of unresolved anxiety, which is like a signal of danger, plus all the defensive behaviors we do, that's a lot of what we call mental illness, really, when it comes to the climate. So that's a lot of what we might call climate anxiety, or a reason why the climate emergency contributes to more mental illness.
Can I piggyback on that?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the additional impacts is the sense of isolation, that nobody wants to keep hearing how you're not going to use paper plates at your holiday dinner, right? Nobody,
Mm-hmm.
there's eye rolling, there's people who have told me, oh, I brought a bag for you to put your recycling in, right? Not for us to recycle as a community, but I'm the activist, and so there's a separation there. And I think that that isolation and that sense of not being accepted by family and friends and coworkers and governments, on and on and on, um, is a huge driver for the emotional distress that a lot of people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah,
So,
if
from
I
a
can
life-
also add to that, there's a real disparity between the truths and the orientation, the worldview that is guiding those activists, or those individuals' sense of attention and focus, and between that business as usual. And that disparity, that dissonance can create, I mean, a very alien and othered kind of emotion. And to your point, Charles, about, the positive emotions, I think it's so important to note that so many of these responses are normative responses, right? So-called normative responses,
Mhm.
really diseased system to a pathological system that, we are simply like, our responses are a litmus test. It's a barometer for what it is that we are absorbing, what we're seeing, what we're responding to. And also in terms of those positive emotions, we only grieve that which we love, right? So we wouldn't feel such tremendous sadness. We wouldn't feel such tremendous despair for a more than human world that we don't love intensely.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there are incredible emotions to tap into there, for sure.
Mhm. Yes.
Rachel,
think I'd-
Rebecca?
yeah, I think I'd like to come back to something though that is really very important, is that I don't think climate anxiety takes only one form or is visible in only one form. And the reason I say that is because I think actually business as usual is also anxiety. And when you look statistically at how many people carry and worry and hold value around the issue of climate change, it is actually statistically the majority of people in the United States. And it is actually for reasons that we very, very much value. It's not the most kind of cynical version of reasons. It is because people love and care about the future of their children, their families, and that is what motivates people to be involved. It's also what motivates people to care. That does not mean everyone is active around it. And in fact, what we have found is that the more overwhelmed people feel, the less active they look. So there's not a one-to-one correlation between the amount of activity out there and action out there and the amount of anxiety and distress. In fact, part of our work really is figuring out that bandwidth between distress that is actually motivating in the ways that Moore and Sammy and Joe, like that we've all been talking about, and levels of distress that shut us down, that turn us into something numb and avoidance. And we're looking for that very, very, very important bandwidth, because that's actually where the majority of us can show up to our caring in a way that does not demobilize us. And that, I think, is the goal. And I think it's really important to remember that the majority of people feel this way. And so when we point at people saying there's no activity going on, that's also a sign of distress and of helplessness. And we really need to look at that, because we come out with all sorts of different assumptions about whether we are the only one in the room wanting to speak about it, when in fact we're not. There's a whole false conspiracy of silence around that I think is really profoundly disorienting and leads us in very, very different directions around how we talk about climate anxiety and all the language of climate distress.
These are great points. I love what people are saying. And just to add one thing from a psychodynamic perspective, well, the word anxiety gets used, 1,000 different ways in general. But psychodynamically, oftentimes we're thinking about what we call signal anxiety, which is anxiety as a signal of danger. So it's like the equivalent of physical pain, right? Like, don't touch the stove, it hurts, and that teaches you, don't do that again. When we learn to be afraid of our active, healthy emotions, we've got this signal anxiety, like danger signal, when we feel those things. And then they break it down further. There's realistic anxiety, which is this is in response to an actual threat, like the climate emergency, and that mobilizes us to do something, right? Like saying, you got to do something different. So then we get angry, we get, we feel our love to protect or to nurture, or maybe we move to our grief if it's something that's lost, or we reach out for help. And, the distress cry is a way of, elicit help and support. But we can have neurotic anxiety, which is anxiety about those feelings. And then that's when we get in trouble. And Rebecca, I think some of what you're talking about is then like defensive reactions to not feel whatever we feel. I'm going to get busy with work, right? I'm going to avoid everything. Or I'm going to go to a place of hopelessness or helplessness. And of course, there's reasons to actually feel some hopelessness and helplessness, but there's also like a pseudo helplessness of I'm just going to assume everything is lost and I can't do anything because then I don't have to feel what I feel. So there's a lot of things that we do that we can think of as defenses. And the importance being it can orient us to, well, what's the emotion underneath? Because that's what's mobilizing.
Charles, you mentioned earlier, you talked about anger and love as kind of the base emotions behind a lot of this. You've also referred to anger, rage, and love as emotions of political resistance and solidarity. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you go to research on social movements and theory about social movements, and of course, love is an emotion of solidarity. The love in the sense of nurturing and caring for others, also caring for the more than human world. So we can think of this as the sense of solidarity and being with others, and that they're a part of ourselves, and we care about them. So we want to do something to be sure they're okay. And anger is widely seen as the essential political emotion. That's the emotion of resistance, where we want to fight. And there's research that shows that anger is more associated with activism than any other emotion. So it's incredibly important. And I'm talking about a healthy version of anger because again, anger gets it gets a bad rap in some ways, and sometimes we just equate it with more of an angry discharge, which is really we can see that dynamically as a defense against the anxiety and the actual experience, like the experience of our anger as it really is inside. And we can just kind of blow it out and get rid of it. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about anger as a healthy emotion that mobilizes political action and climate action.
So when you're talking about climate anxiety leading to mental health issues, we're not just talking about the internal issues, we're talking about broader social issues.
Well, if I understand you right, yes, it has the internal effect of distress and sabotaging the way we're living our lives. And it also has an effect on our ability to engage politically. So, which gets at why do we have that anxiety about our feelings? And maybe there's a political reason for that too. It serves, yeah, sorry.
If I can jump in, so Charles, you're a dynamic therapist. I am a CBT and DBT therapist, and in DBT we really emphasize that emotions all serve a purpose, right? And I think emotions get a bad rap in that this is a bad emotion or this is a good emotion or anger is a negative emotion, but every emotion really does serve a purpose. And part of my role as a clinician is really to help somebody almost like translate what these emotions are trying to tell us. Right. So when you are seeing literally the world on fire, right? I'm in New York City a few weeks ago. In November, we had droughts where Prospect Park in Brooklyn was on fire, Inwood Park on the northern tip of Manhattan was on fire, and the Palisades across the Hudson were on fire. There was smoke in the skies because there were wildfires and brush fires in Manhattan and surrounding it in November. So when you're seeing the world on fire, if you're feeling scared, if you're feeling angry, it's really valid given what you're experiencing. Our goal as advocates, as individuals who are trying to thrive, is to figure out why am I feeling this way? What are my emotions telling me about my values? And how could I implement those to create a better life for myself and other people around us? So we have to really understand where they're coming from, understand what our emotions are trying to tell us, and then figure out how to utilize that to drive action in an effective manner, rather than lashing out with aggression at someone that doesn't deserve it, or rather than just being overwhelmed by the anxiety. Right? The emotions really tell us who we are, what we care about. We just have to listen to them and figure out how to be productive with them.
Sammy.
So taking the climate anxiety model a little bit broader, environmental activists often experience two things that kind of exacerbate whatever everybody's been talking about here. The first is occupational identity. And so these are people who don't just, go to work and they come home and they take their paycheck and that's the end of it. These are people who have dedicated their lives, whether educationally, maybe as deep volunteers, but people who have said, I identify as an environmental activist. This is who I am. And along with that is the term moral injury. And so moral
Mm.
injury is being in a position where you see something happening, some sort of pain, something dangerous, something harmful, and you are not able to do anything about it, even if it's part of your job. So, I think about all those EPA employees who are stymied. I had a conversation with a woman with the Kansas Geological Survey a few years ago who said, even though our Ogallala aquifer is drying up and probably doesn't have more than 20 years worth of water in it,
Mhm.
through the Geological Survey, they are not allowed to share that from a
Mm.
scientific perspective. And it adds complexity to worry and fear and love for the planet and all that. So there's these additional emotions that activists carry.
Mhm. Mhm.
And Sammy, do you find that not just in the US, but worldwide, the recent elections that we're seeing that seem to be leaning towards more climate denialism, do you feel like that's having an impact on our environmental activists?
Oh, it's having a huge impact. So one of the things that's coming down the pike is the possibility, the very real possibility of funding being cut, even for environmental protection agency grants and the inflation reduction grants that are being threatened, even though they've been approved and authorized, that funding is threatened to be cut. And so there was a research study by Fast Company a few years ago that showed that only 2% of all of the great charitable donations that are made around the globe, only 2% go to environmental causes. And of that, only 4% go to the smaller nonprofits. And so this idea that grant money, especially federal money, is going to be cut is huge. And there's the other component that those of us who were around in the 2016 administration know that this time the impacts against environmental protection are going to be much more strategic and more directed than they were in that first administration. So, yeah, it's impacting a lot of people in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Rebecca?
I was just going to add a little footnote to what Sammy was saying about philanthropy, and that in addition to only 2% going to climate, and of that only 4% going to small nonprofits, an even tinier percentage goes towards anything about social and cultural and relational aspects of climate change. So to the extent it's getting funded, it's almost entirely on the scientific and technological and adaptation side of things, and not on the human relationships, which is so much what we're talking about. That if the human relationships and the human psyche is not supported and enabled to take action in all the various ways it needs to, then we're in more trouble than we already know.
Mhm.
And so just yet again, sort of underlining Sammy's point about the scarcity of those resources and how precious they are, and how they are also under attack, including the organizations that we're all part of.
Mhm.
Rebecca, is climate anxiety a woke issue?
No. I care a lot about that, and I put it in the speaker notes because I believe that one of the very devastating things that has come about through the growing authoritarian threat and the rise of the GOP, this version of the GOP in particular, is that it has managed to frame issues of distress related to climate as if it comes from a very specific and singular political perspective, when there could not be anything further from the truth. That anybody who is experiencing the effect of climate change, whether it's directly through fires, as Joe was talking about, through hurricanes, repeated hurricanes, through drought, homelessness, starvation, all the future questions that we were talking about, quite literally everyone who experiences those things is experiencing some form of distress related to climate. It's who gets the label, for whom is it labeled, and how does that label either divide us or connect us? And a huge aspect of Climate Psychology Alliance is actually trying to get rid of the idea that there's one form of climate distress or one population that feels climate distress, but that in fact we are all feeling it in different terms, different language, different politics, different geographies. And our goal really is to try to find ways to connect our emotions to the emotions of other people in a way that generates solidarity and not division, which I think is we're at very severe risk of precisely by naming climate anxiety as a woke issue as opposed to a universal issue.
I couldn't agree more. Joe?
There's, to Rebecca's point, there actually was a study just released, and there's actually been a few studies on this in past years, but this really isn't a political issue when you actually look at the research. So it might be a conversation that is happening on front of a camera, makes it look political, but when you break it down, and a study just came out looking at US children actually, and across every single state in America, whether it's considered a typical red or blue state, across their political identities, kids, a majority of them, I think something close like 75% of kids across the country are saying this is a problem, I'm concerned about this, and people aren't listening to me, including their own governments, right, and their own state and local governments. So I think it is interesting that there is this schism occurring on maybe a more national discussion-based level. But when you look at the ground and look at the communities, there isn't as much of a divide here. And I think a big portion of how we work on like solving this issue, getting people on board, is to actually figure out how to have a more local conversation and have a conversation driven by emotions, because emotions do sell. I think we're all here. We have data to back up our comments. We have these really attractive looking graphs, but really highlighting this as a personal issue and highlighting personal stories and highlighting how this impacts everybody across the board, whether it's their groundwater is going to be polluted because of fracking, or they actually like want to breathe clean air, how dare they, or they're in the line of hurricanes. I think when you get to that ground level, people are like, yes, this is something I care about. This is something that is important to me. So I think we just have to figure out how to have more of those conversations instead of just labeling this issue as one side of the political spectrum. But I think we can get a lot of power that way.
I want to stop in, just in case we don't have time, is that there's an article that just came out that was absolutely beautiful about Hurricane Helene, and the ways in which a community that had all sorts of divisions within it prior to Hurricane Helene started developing mutual aid responses where all of the divisions between people started breaking down precisely because they understood that the resilience depends on building community and breaking down all of the intellectualized or politicized divisions. So to Joe's point, the more local, the more based in community, and I'm sure Extinction Rebellion, like all of these kinds of things, are trying to think a lot about sort of how do we build those community level responses that are based on emotion and solidarity and connectedness. Again, that depends on our not buying into the idea that climate anxiety is a rare feeling or an exceptional feeling, but is in fact one that we all are finding that we come to at various different points and junctures.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Sammy Aaron, Dr. Charles Couchman, Moore Keshet, Dr. Joseph Talercio, and Rebecca Weston about how climate anxiety is impacting mental health. Let's talk a little bit more about the ways to cope with climate anxiety and how it's changing us. Joe, I mean, as the effects of climate change become more present and climate anxiety apparently more common, you think it's changing the way people plan for the future?
Yeah, unfortunately, and I guess fortunately because people are alert to it, but it is changing it drastically. If you talk to people, they are, there's a big shift, especially with the pandemic, of moving to some states like in the Sun Belt, right? Arizona, Florida, these states have been growing in popularity. And there is all the research kind of dictates that there might actually be this reverse migration over time. So people's moving limits are going to change. Cities like Las Vegas has to really start considering how much they can expand because they're running out of water. But on an individual level too, you talk to really a lot of youth I talk to actually, in fact, talk about this concern. And there's a lot of research out there, people reporting of questioning family planning, questioning if they actually want to have children, questioning if they could afford to move to an area that is going to be less vulnerable to it. So unfortunately, it really does seem to be impacting how people are living their life currently, where they are living, where they're considering living, and what actually their future game plans are going to be.
What are some of the ways we can help ourselves work through these emotions, climate anxiety? How do we deal with them?
Well, so I'm a big believer in sublimation, right? In taking our emotions and turning them into something else. I think that when we allow our emotions to really begin to kind of get bottlenecked in our being, in our existence, this is really when we tend to veer more into overwhelm and into despair. So, I mean, there was this incredible landmark study in the 90s about individuals living with HIV/AIDS, right? People who were able to safely disclose their health status to the close people in their lives had much better health outcomes. Just that ability to self-express. Humans have this unique symbolic mind. To my knowledge, we have the only symbolic mind of all the species on this planet. And we have this incredible propensity to translate our emotions into something else, right? So whether it is that we create art about it, we journal about it, we make music about it, we come together with other people to create. I mean, I think that each of us in our own way is kind of a testament to this, that there can be tremendous purpose and intention making around this crisis. I know that for me, it has really fueled a tremendous amount of work and activity in and around self-actualization, right? So to be able to find other like-minded people in community, whether it's in our immediate community, in the virtual community, to come together and to create a life of purpose, of meaning. But I really go back to the sublimation piece in terms of allowing ourselves to have the time and space to create around these feelings, so that they don't become really stifled within us.
You've also noted that being more decisive can help navigate climate emotions. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, so much of it, right? We're talking about learned helplessness and hopelessness. There is so much that, the administration, the EPA, I mean, these are such massive issues. These are systemic issues which are outside my immediate locus of control. And that can lead to much of what Rebecca was talking about before in terms of that avoidance, right? So if we actually lean into what is within my locus of control, what is, where do my decisive actions have impact, both in the immediate and in the ripple effects that they can possibly create in the world. The piece that sometimes creates discomfort for people around that is that doesn't necessarily come with certainty. That if I make decisive actions, it doesn't mean that I'm guaranteed to know what the outcome will be. Our minds love certainty. We love to know what's around the corner, right? We don't have that here. We kind of have to let go of that and to embrace uncertainty, to embrace that, there are things that we simply don't have the foresight to be able to tell with absolutes. But to really, yes, to hone in on that locus of control can be very empowering over what I'm choosing to do, how I'm choosing to spend my finite resources, time, energy, focus, attention, relationships. What am I doing? What ripples am I creating in the world?
Charles, what are your suggestions for dealing with climate anxiety?
Well, as someone who thinks a lot about how there's these active feelings underneath anxiety or the other symptoms we have related to it, I think connecting with those feelings is incredibly important and can be liberating for us. And by that, these feelings, the active feelings, it's our body's impulses. So we feel them somatically in our bodies. And so we can actually tune in and notice, what's happening inside. What is the energy inside us that wants to come out in some way and be expressed in some way? First, there may be tension. That's a sign of anxiety, though. So looking under the tension, if we're in our thoughts, it can sort of keep us away from just staying in our bodies and feeling what we feel. And then, it's if we feel, say, the anger about the situation, that's equivalent to saying we're feeling our desire to resist and to fight back and to do something about it. We may choose not to. It may not be what's right for us, and that's okay. And that may leave us with, having to do some grief over, we're not able to take the action we may otherwise want to. We may feel that love that wants to protect others. But there may be circumstances where we can take more action than we realized before. We may realize that we've been telling ourselves that we are helpless when actually we don't have. We're only powerful in solidarity with others, of course. But in solidarity, we're not helpless. There's a lot that we can do. And if we can realize that and act from it, I think that's a way of respecting what our organism is longing for. And we're not going to be sort of satisfied until we're able to do that. It's stressful too. It's stressful to get active. It brings things up for sure. But I think for some people that can be a good option.
I just want to say one more thing, that it's okay to do things, to Charles's point, in a titrated way, right? If a chemist, just pours the acids in, it can create an explosion. These are really, really big and fragmented and overwhelming emotional states. And it's okay to visit them a little bit at a time and engage a little bit at a time, and then, compartmentalize. Walk away for a bit, engage in normal life, so to speak, right? So we're not going to solve, this is a marathon. And I think that that's something that we also kind of need to internalize. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon that we're all going to be in really for the duration of our lives. So we're going to have to come up with systems that are emotionally, psycho-spiritually sustaining for us, that are resilience building and creating, expressing, connecting with other people, eating nourishing foods, making art, spending time in nature, with nature, giving back to nature. These are all resilience building activities, so to speak.
I'll piggyback on that. So at the Resilient Activist, we have a workshop called 4 Steps for a Resilient Life. And it's geared towards activists. And basically, it helps activists see what actions they're taking right now that they're happy about, they're joyful, they, pardon me, they have the money, the time, the energy to be able to continue working on that particular issue, and what things they're doing that bring them grief, that keep them up all night, that they don't have the money for, they feel like they're, taking time away from their families. And so this 4 steps helps people. It's a really simple way to help people let go, titrate out what isn't working for them. And so that leaves more space for things that they love to do. And just to see people's faces like, oh, I could quit doing that. I'd have permission to quit doing that thing. Yeah, you do. Go do an internet search and just ask how many people are working on this issue globally. And, when you see 19 billion responses, you'll know it's okay for you to step aside from that one issue. So,
Joe, can you talk about green spaces and how they can help improve psychiatric health?
Sure. So obviously everything everyone's talking about tremendously helps. Collective action is so powerful. And we can also take advantage of nature to help us feel better. Green spaces has been proven over and over again, and exposure to green spaces has been proven over and over again to substantially help our mental health for a number of reasons. One is the complex shapes that we see in nature seem to just provide us the sense of comfort, right? Think about like when you look at the sun shining through the leaves, there's so much complexity there that isn't overwhelming to us. It somehow like stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system in our brain. When we're outside, we're also hearing sounds of nature, which also triggers the parasympathetic, the relaxation centers of the brain. There's actually 3 sounds that naturally produce relaxation impacts of our brain, and that is the sound of wind through the leaves, the sound of running water, and the sound of birds. And when we are exposed to that, we actually feel at ease. And I think this is one, I didn't know this, but during the pandemic, I got into bird watching. I live in New York City. Central Park is very empty. And I guess this is what was going on, is I just really enjoy hearing birds and hearing the wind, and I still do that today. I go out whenever I get a chance with binoculars. But those things really just by themselves help us. But what we also know is when we produce green spaces, right, the green spaces also help clean the environment, right? More trees means cleaner air. It also means their communities can be more engaged and have a space where they all can come together, identify with the collective action. So it produces a more welcoming environment, a more psychologically comforting environment, in addition to having direct impacts on our biological functioning. So they're impressive areas, and we really need more of them. It's just unfortunately, and this connects with another issue with climate changes, there's also this racial injustice component attached with climate change. And areas that are predominantly Black or Latino, areas that have a lower socioeconomic status, these areas are less likely to have green spaces. So while we already know these communities are already suffering, now they don't have green spaces, so there's extra suffering. They're more vulnerable to extreme heat, for example, because green spaces also keep the temperature down. So it really kind of highlights this complexity there. And not that creating green space is going to solve everything, but it really highlights like a very important factor that we have to consider, of a tool that might be present that we can use. And also when it's not there, how it really is highlighting more discrimination in terms of the greater climate discussion.
Rebecca, I know that earlier we talked about the benefits of turning anxiety into action. Would you like to talk about that?
I would, very much. And I think part of that I want to sort of emphasize is that as much as I think it's a very common and mostly correct saying to say one of the ways of dealing with anxiety is to turn it into action, to sublimate and all of those things, that I'm completely for that. I also don't think that all forms of action are equal in their abilities to achieve not only a sense of efficacy, but actually effectively addressing climate change. And what I don't want is to foster the idea that one should take action just to address the anxiety, but instead, what are the actions that can actually address the issue? And I think the biggest and most problematic and smart thing that the fossil fuel industry did was to individualize the problem and to turn the problem into human beings being primarily consumers, and that the only way we can impact this problem is by consumption or lack of consumption. And I think, in fact, that reduces human beings to their most simple and least interesting aspect of their identity, whereas everything we've been talking about here is our capacity to feel, our capacity to relate, our capacity to have ideas, our capacity to connect and build alternative systems. And so when I think about turning this anxiety into action, I feel very strongly that it needs to be collective action, relational action that builds on the feelings and support and capacities and solidarity of people, which is why I called you attention to this article about North Carolina by Justin Cook. I really want people to read it. It's so beautiful because it shows people who did not believe in collective action, people who didn't necessarily buy into the language of climate change necessarily, all of a sudden finding in their day-to-day growing capacities for connection, and to borrow people who had contractor skills with people who had electrical skills, who had people who had cooking skills, and the kind of robust generative quality of people coming together to address climate change. And I really think that anything we talk about around action will be most powerful and most rewarding and most effective is if it's collective and taking on actually the issues of climate change and not just to make us feel better. That's corollary, but not automatic.
That's such a good point, Rebecca. And certainly in the mental health world, there's so much emphasis on self-care, right? Self-care and wellness. And so many of the events and offerings that I've been to have been solely focused on how can I feel better? It can be really quite self-serving. And what you're talking about, I mean, it's utterly cooperative and reciprocal. And it's an antidote to the isolation and the polarization that we're talking about, right? So, which is also inherently good for oneself, that when you become completely integrated in a system that is working collectively to do better, create better, envision better, that is, I mean, completely empowering. Yeah.
It's an ecosystem that we live in. We're not individuals. ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the collective problem.
Yeah.
We have something that we teach that's ways to impact both the environment, earth care, and self-care, and how to bring them together. And so our favorite story is really if there's nothing else you can do or you don't know what else to do, just find 5 square feet in the backyard or 2 big pots on a patio and put in pollinator habitat. And so where you can see it out your window, if possible, in all seasons, because what that does is it brings in that deep nature connection. It brings in that somatic ability to our circadian rhythms and the seasons, right? While it's impacting water quality, erosion control. A lot of the native plants have an affinity for chemicals. So there's these ways of having it all, but you have to be real creative to think about them, right? It's a really good point.
I think a lot of,
Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, I think a lot of what causes us not to take care of ourselves is actually anger turned inward. It's very hard in our society to have anger at people with power, and we're taught not to do so in a lot of different ways. But that anger still needs to go somewhere. It can go to other people. It can lead to polarization and scapegoating and all that, or it can go on ourselves. We can beat ourselves up, feeling guilty we're not doing enough or whatever it is. But we can also recognize, well, that's actually a feeling that wants to go out. And I think when we're in touch with these feelings that naturally want to be directed outward, be it anger or love, I think we can still, I don't think that affects us to not treat ourselves well, but it does result in less of a self-focus, which is also, I think, what we're taught by people with power in our culture, to be individuals, to be selfish, to put yourself first. Your self-esteem is what matters the most, or being the best kind of person. All this doesn't really matter very much when you're more in touch with those feelings that naturally want to engage in the world. And so I think that that's not a reason to do that, right? But it's sort of a side benefit of being in touch with our love and our anger about what's happening.
Joe?
Everything we're all saying is so important about like collective action and understanding our emotions. But I also want to highlight that there's something almost like a baseline we have to do is also understand that we have vulnerabilities from the environment, in the sense that because of the changing world, they were actually more likely to feel overwhelmed by emotions, or more likely to be almost be frozen by what we're feeling. And part of, I think, the solution is also turning inward and recognizing that we have vulnerabilities to rising temperatures and illness, for example, right? As there's more hurricanes, we're going to see infections and diseases as waterways become contaminated. As temperature rises, and if we're on psychiatric medications, for example, and 1 in 6 Americans are on psychiatric medications, but actually psychiatric medication use makes us more vulnerable to extreme heat and deregulates our ability to handle heat exposure. So I do think that another layer on this is to kind of look inward and say, what actually about me makes me particularly vulnerable to the changing world? Because if we don't work on ourselves first, it doesn't matter what kind of collective action we do. It doesn't matter what community we're engaged with, right? We have to take care of ourselves first to be ready to handle that bigger picture. And so I just want to highlight that there is that need to look at ourselves first. So, Rebecca?
I love this conversation. So it was enthusiasm that made me do that, not trying to interrupt you. So I apologize for that. But
no, you're good.
But I don't think it's a first or second. I think they happen at the same time. And I think that the capacity engaged in I'm an activist, have been an activist almost all my life at all different scales. And I can tell you that I have found more capacity about who I am as an individual when I am engaged in collective struggle and back. Like, I think it really is a dialectical process. And so it's not first or second, it's both and in the way they really do relate. I feel so much better when I'm out in the world connecting, so I can then also internally feel calmer when I'm at home. Like, I think it really goes back and forth. And that's not remotely to say that we should not do the internal work. I 100% agree with that. But I think, again, human beings are social creatures. And so that internal work happens in a collective society. So how does that rotate back and forth? I think that's a fantastic, I love this conversation.
We're collective
Sammy,
society, and we're also just completely interwoven. right? What happens to you impacts me and vice versa. And what's happening to the bees is affecting me, and what's happening to a community thousands of miles away is affecting me and all of you, right? So it's really kind of reflective of that notion of interbeing, that this is a vast cosmic array of life, and we are each so singular and so essential within that collective. And so I agree, it has to be a yes and a together.
Sammy, where can people go to find help? Say you're survival of a weather disaster or something. Where do you go to find emotional support? Where do individuals and organizations go to learn how to cope with climate anxiety?
I'll tell you what, the past 4 or 5 years, you can just do an internet search and there's all kinds of stuff that comes up. There are so many books out there. There are so many organizations. So the organizations here, as well as Climate and Mental Health Network, Climate Psychiatry Alliance, there are a whole lot of resources that didn't used to be there. I just got an invitation to a retreat from a faith-based community in my area that's going to have a weekend climate anxiety retreat. I don't even know these people. It's like, this is so cool. It's happening. For people who are actually in the midst of an environmental catastrophe of some sort, natural event, couple of resources. One is go to 211.org. It's a program from the United Way that has all kinds of resources for disaster recovery. Okay. They also have all kinds of resources for mental health support. But in addition to that, I know that the Climate Psychiatry Alliance is just developing their regional hubs. And so there will be some communities available of people who are professionals who get it, who are able to be in a particular region at a particular time and provide support. So I would just say get on as many mailing lists as you're interested in, because the resources and the support are really, really beefing up. One other thing, we do host a climate cafe, which is a free event based on the Death Cafes. I know the Climate Psychology Alliance is also hosting theirs and training on it. Look for a climate cafe in your area or on Zoom. It's that community, it's that safe space. No one's going to roll their eyes at you, and you'll be inspired by the work that everybody else is doing.
Rebecca, could you talk a little bit about ways other psychiatric professionals could get engaged?
Psychiatric professionals or psychological? I'm not a psychiatrist.
Either one.
The Climate Psychiatry Alliance is absolutely developing both the sort of knowledge set that is so vital for some of what's been talked about here in terms of the health and mental health impacts of heat, hurricanes, et cetera. And the Climate Psychology Alliance has something called the Climate Aware Therapy Directory, which is if people are seeking very specific individual support for particularly acute levels of distress, and they want to understand how that plays into other aspects of their life. We are also very much supporting and developing other forms of care, the Climate Cafe model, although we are working on the name of that in different regions. Will it always be called Climate Cafe? We're not sure. But certainly the work that Sammy does is essential to that. I think Moore has things that she would love to probably talk about in terms of the Mandala Project and art processes for that. And we're also developing other sorts of resources for disaster work, farm workers, et cetera, who are all experiencing the distress in different language. So certainly, and then there's the Good Grief Network, which has a fabulous program devoted towards different populations and different audiences, which is a 10-part program to develop people's capacity to stay with the problem and then sublimate it into different kinds of work. There's lots of different organizations. And so I support Sammy's, you Google it, and there will be a lot out there.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work? Charles?
Well, if you want to check out Extinction Rebellion, you can just Google Extinction Rebellion. There's chapters all over the world. Throw that in there and throw in your city or your country, and you'll find out a lot more about Extinction Rebellion. My practice is at www.drcharlescouchman.com, which is just Dr. Charles Couchman, all one word. And I have some information on there, not a lot, but I do work with people around the country.
Where can people go to learn more about your practice?
Well, I definitely recommend that people go to the Climate Psychology Alliance website. And I'm on social media, so people can find me on Instagram at Moore Keshet Art Therapist. And my website is moorekeshet.com, which is MORKESHET.com.
Thank you. Joe?
So in addition to everything that's been said, I think other things that come to mind is the American Psychological Association has a lot of resources related to climate change. They're also publishing. I actually, in fact, just had a paper published in like their main journal, American Psychologist, all about climate and heat, although that's driven more towards a scientific audience. But then another organization I'm a part of is the Union of Concerned Scientists, which started initially to kind of help denuclearize the world and have pivoted now to focusing on climate change and related concerns. And they work with lawyers, a lot of political advocacy, but a lot of outreach and education as well, and lots of great resources on there. The organization really has pivoted to working towards climate justice and education and reform. So really, really helpful resource, whether you're a clinician or just somebody who's curious and interested in looking for assistance.
Thank you. Sammy, what's your website?
theresilientactivist.org. And one more resource, ecopsychopedia.org, Rebecca?
Yes.
.org. And it is everything anyone would want to know about climate change and mental health, a joint project from the Climate Psychiatry and Climate Psychology Alliances. I have an article on there about activists, and it's fantastic. Free resource.
Thank you. Rebecca, what's your website again?
I put it up there. It's www.climatepsychology.us.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.